It's been one of those winters when the rain just never seemed to ease up. But now, in early April, the sun is finally shining. The purple moorgrass on Bodmin Beacon Local Nature Reserve, opposite my house, is glistening with wetness. I can finally get out to do some filming. The winter nap males finally have a chance to perform their aerial dance routine. Well, they'll also do this on sunny days over snow in midwinter. The first tree to come into flower each year is the hazel. These are the male catkins. They produce clouds of pollen that fertilise the tiny female flowers, and eventually these become nuts. At this stage of the year, there's still no sign of any leaves on any of the trees. This robin has been here all winter, but now with spring approaching, he's becoming more active in defending his territory with song. The first wild flower to come into bloom is the lesser celandine. The dronefly is one of the very few insects that can be seen in every month of the year in Britain. The genuine wild daffodil is much smaller and daintier than most of its garden counterparts. Late March and early April is the perfect time to look for the spectacular scarlet elf-cup fungus. It prefers marshy ground, mainly under willows, on whose dead wood it flourishes. It's rather local in Britain, mainly western. In Cornwall it can occur in thousands. As spring develops, the lesser celandines begin to carpet the ground in thousands. This common butterfly will have spent the whole winter perched in the open on a tree, exposed to the full fury of the elements. Up on Bodmin Beacon, the blackthorn is now in full bloom. Unlike the hazel, the blackthorn is pollinated by insects rather than depending on the wind. However, compared with a bee, this red admiral butterfly will act as rather a poor pollinator. Like the robin, this dunnock has spent the winter here, but unlike the robin, it hasn't been singing until now, as spring arrives. It's now that song becomes vital for establishing breeding and nesting territories. Throughout the winter, flocks of blue tits thoroughly search the oak buds for signs of food. What they're looking for particularly is caterpillars in their early stages overwintering in the buds. The searching is so thorough and over such a long period that it's amazing that anything survives until the spring. At last, the first chiffchaff, back on Bodmin Beacon after its long northward migration from its overwintering grounds in Africa. Another sign of spring's progression, the first peacock butterfly basking in the welcome warmth of the sun. It would have spent the winter hibernating in a hollow tree or beneath a pile of wood or some such place. The bursting into bloom of the willow catkins provides an instant bonanza for numerous insects and other animals looking for a meal. These are the male catkins with their halo of yellow pollen. The female catkins are born on a separate tree. This buff-tailed bumblebee queen, recently emerged from hibernation, is cashing in on the sheer abundance of the willow pollen. It means she can quickly gather sufficient supplies to rear her first brood of larvae. Once they emerge as adults, they will instantly set to work, assisting their mother in raising the subsequent broods. The chances are that willow catkins will also provide the first meal of the year for many overwintered peacock butterflies. If we take a closer look at the male catkins, you can see just how much of the yellow pollen there is available. By contrast, the female flowers, lacking pollen, are fairly drab and quite inconspicuous. Pollen provides a protein-rich meal, so it's not surprising that these catkins are much sought after by foraging flocks of goldfinches. Note how the bird grips the catkin in its foot while it rips off the pollen-rich anthers with its beak. The flat top of Bodmin Beacon is rather heathy, with lots of purple moorgrass and gorse. Perfect habitat for linnets, seen here still in their winter plumage. Blue tits were also attracted to the willow catkins. From the way they behaved, picking up a catkin, quickly throwing it away, onto the next one, I presume they're looking for insects rather than feeding on the pollen, as the goldfinches were. Male and female blue tits look identical. I hadn't realised I was following a female until she suddenly spotted her mate nearby and went into this sexual display, whereupon they mated. No matter what else I was filming, the resident robin was always close by. By now the first leaves are appearing on the trees. As usual, the hawthorns come first. This long-tailed tit is searching for insects among the fresh leaves on a dog rose bush. The drumming of the great spotted woodpecker is a frequent sound in springtime. This is not filmed on the beacon but down on the Camel Trail in Bodmin. Close to the woodpecker tree, a male chaffinch took the chance to have a quick bath. Early April is a super busy time at the local rookery on the south side of Bodmin. There's a constant coming and going of birds as they bring in new supplies of sticks to expand their nests or to build new ones. This rookery has greatly increased in size over the last few years. Three weeks later, after the leaves came, not a single nest was visible. This early in the year, male speckled wood butterflies mostly bask on the ground, dashing off to do battle with nearby males over ownership of their territory and access to females. Fortunately for us, Cornwall has not suffered the devastating effects of Dutch elm disease as seen in other parts of the country, and the sight of a large elm in fruit is still quite common here. Many of the seeds never get to fall to the ground as they are very attractive to foraging wood pigeons. Unfortunately, because of a local drought, food is much harder for the local blackbirds to come by. This male, desperately searching beneath the crisp dried leaves, failed to find a single insect or other item to feed to its babies. Then suddenly, around mid-April, there's a wonderful new sound on the beacon. The melodious, liquid, gentle descending warble of the willow warbler. Probably my favourite sound. Like the chiffchaff earlier, it had a long flight up from Africa. Every now and again, this male had to break off from singing to search for food. But singing is the most important thing. It's there to establish a territory and get a mate. In its plumage, the willow warbler looks more or less identical to a chiffchaff, and it's really not until they open their beaks and sing that you can tell the difference. That's the chiffchaff. On the ground below, the song thrushes were also having a hard time finding food because of the drought. Meanwhile, down in the beautiful Glyn Valley woodlands, the primroses are in full flower, along with the brilliant white of the wood anemones. Attracted to both of these is one of my favourite insects, the dark-edged bee fly. You can see the dark edge applies to the leading edge of the wings. Like a miniature hummingbird, it zips from flower to flower, hovering as it feeds, although usually holding on as well with its front legs. In reality, it's probably a flower thief. This is because it's quite poorly adapted for actually carrying away pollen. The males spend much of their time hovering in some sunny glade, waiting for a female to pass by. Once each female has actually mated, she heads for an area of sandy bare ground. At the tip of her body, she has a so-called sand chamber. As she vibrates her body, she fills this with sand grains, and these are used to coat each of her eggs before she lays it. Here you can actually see the chamber vibrating against the ground like a miniature pile driver. Once all her eggs are suitably coated with sand, off she flies to start laying them. What she needs to find is some nest holes of solitary bees in the ground. These may be well camouflaged, but she's very good at finding them. She drops each egg as close to her burrow as possible. She needs to do this because her tiny larva, after hatching from the egg, needs to enter the burrow and get down to the bee larva within. Her larva will then attach itself to the outside of the bee larva and feed on it. The burrow of the grey-patched mining bee is one of those the bee fly will be targeting. The burrow is often placed amongst grass. Down on the shore, it's time for one of the very low April spring tides. This beautiful snake-locked anemone will always be here. But today there's a treat in store. Hordes of newcomers have arrived. Hundreds of sea hares have headed inshore to spawn. This one is about 15 centimetres long. Its dark reddish coloration reflects the fact that it's been feeding on similarly coloured seaweeds. They don't always stick to the rules though. This reddish specimen is chewing away on some green seaweed. You often find, rather puzzlingly, a small specimen perched up on the back of a much larger one. Puzzlingly because they're not mating, I'm not really sure exactly what they are doing. As the dropping tide leaves them stranded, they become rather sad blobs of glistening jelly. The sea hares were swimming amongst masses of Tamarisk Weed. This is a rather local seaweed, which is basically brown, but in water it has a beautiful blue or green iridescence. Here and there, common hermit crabs scuttled around. There are a few sea lemons. They feed on encrusting sponges. While the strange blobby bacella prefers to prey on sea squirts. And then, after my day excursion to the shore, it's back to Bodmin Beacon, where the pigeons are in a nuptial mood. The target of all this cooing is singularly unimpressed. A brief bout of nuptial feeding precedes copulation. After mating, it's time to relax for a while and engage in a session of preening. Now is the time to start collecting twigs for for the very untidy nest in a nearby holly bush. Pigeons seem to be very fussy about their twigs. They'll often try several before they finally select one. After a brief doze, with me standing really close, quite amazingly so, it's time to get back to work. As well as picking them up from the ground, they will also try and break twigs directly off the trees above. It's not always obvious which twigs are actually dead, so it tests them by giving a hard tug. The local robin has been equally busy, but now and again it's time to take a break and bask in the sun. Just a few steps from that basking robin there's a small patch of wild garlic, also known as ramsons. This is the plant you can smell before you see it. The leaves start appearing above ground quite early, towards the end of March, but by June they've withered away again completely. The flowers are visited by a number of different insects. These include the grey-patched mining bee that we saw earlier on Bluebell. Just look at the great mass of yellow pollen attached to the hind legs on the so-called pollen baskets. The attractive little bee fly is also partial to the flowers. However, there's one insect, the hoverfly Portavinia maculata, that you will only ever find associated with wild garlic plants, and yet it never seems to visit the flowers, at least in my experience. Its presence is because its larvae develop inside the garlic bulbs. By now, in late April, the bluebells are in full magnificent display. Bluebell flowers are very popular with queen bumblebees, including this common carder bee. The female brimstone butterfly is a much paler yellow than the male, almost white in fact. Now it's about time I paid a visit to the Atlantic coast. I want to see how the formers are getting on their nesting cliffs. Unlike the kittiwake, another seabird, which has declined dramatically in Cornwall over the last few years, the former is doing really well and has expanded its numbers greatly. Now is the time for the pairs to invigorate their courtship and cement their bonds. Most people assume that fulmars are gulls, but in fact they belong to the family of tube noses, as will be obvious from their upper beak. In fact, some of the closest relatives of the fulmar are the huge wandering albatrosses of the southern oceans. In some parts of northern Britain, you can get really close to nesting fulmars, but here in Cornwall I had to use a long lens to film them on the vertical cliffs. Back to Bodmin Beacon, and there's a new willow in flower. Unlike the grey willow that we saw flowering in early April, in the eared willow, the much smaller catkins appear alongside the leaves. In early April, we only saw queen bumblebees visiting the catkins of the grey willow. Now, at the end of the month, there's been enough time for the first brood of small, undersized worker bumblebees to appear. These quickly set to work, slaving away, to help their mother, the queen, produce the next brood of sisters. The oaks are now in full leaf, a significant fact for a group of male long-horned moths. These two are sitting ready, poised to launch into the air into their courtship dance. This aerial ballet is usually performed around a sprig of leaves, most often of oak. Late afternoon and early evening is the favoured performance time. If they're successful, a female will fly up, choose one of the dancers, nobody knows how, and then they'll mate. Directly below the performing moths, the greater stitchwort is in full flower. The birches are now festooned with cascades of male catkins, dangling down from spindly twigs. The female catkins are much smaller and less showy and project upwards rather than dangling down. Later in the year, their seeds will be important to the food source for various insects and birds. Over most of Britain, lady smock seems only to grow in damp places, but in Cornwall it also thrives on very dry roadsides. These are all the normal single type of flower. They all have the conventional number of petals. However, this is the flore plano, where some of the stamens are converted into extra petals, forming a kind of double flower. Down in the wet willow woodland near Parr, the yellow irises are in full flower. This is perfect habitat for the moorhen, a very common bird over much of Britain, but quite uncommon in Cornwall. At this time of year, dead willow catkins have rained down from above and litter the surface of the water. Unusually, this wren kept on singing from this very exposed perch. Below him, on the water, a male mallard is taking time out to preen. As you can hear from the background sounds, this oasis of calm is very close to a busy road. Time after time, our wren kept on returning to the same perch. Far away from Parr, on an exposed beach on the Atlantic coast, there's one of the few places where you can get a good view of grey seals hauled out. And so April fades into May.